Well, hello. It's good to see you today. Thanks for tuning in to today's reading. I'm recording this on Friday, May the 28th. And as I'm looking at our calendar here, our reading today comes from Acts chapter 16. However, I'm not going to be reading from Acts chapter 16 today. I wanted to go back and talk a little bit about the previous week's reading, specifically the book of Galatians. And even a couple of days before that, Acts chapters 13 and 14, and what led us into the book of Galatians, as well as Acts chapter 15. I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the backdrop of what's going on, and I wanted to talk about why I have placed Galatians in the particular place that I did on our reading schedule. What I'm trying to do in this year's New Testament reading is to give us the books of the New Testament in chronological order as best I can. Now, we're fairly confident that we know the order and the location of virtually every New Testament book, but there are two general exceptions. Some might say that there's more than that. But in my mind, there are two books that are really difficult to place. One of those is Galatians. I think that Galatians belongs somewhere either just after Acts 14 or just after Acts 15 and the events described there. So let's talk a little bit about this as we try to understand better how our New Testament books fit together, how the Apostle Paul's life and travels and preaching and writings all fit together with Luke's record in the book of Acts. But before I do that, let me say this. It's been almost 2 weeks since I have done a video, and I apologize for that. My family's schedule has been pretty hectic the last couple of weeks, and it's been a little bit challenging for me to get a video published. So, my apologies. I'm trying to do better in the future, but thanks for being patient with me. So let's talk a little bit now about these matters. Back on May the 17th, as I'm looking here at the reading schedule, we started into Acts chapter 13 on that day. Acts chapters 13 and 14 are the Apostle Paul's first missionary journey. Paul and Barnabas are in the city of Antioch in Syria. Antioch in Syria is where all three of Paul's travels, all of his journeys begin. Antioch in Syria, all three of his journeys begin in that city. The church there is to be commended because they were very supportive of Paul's travels and the preaching of the gospel, and I am fairly, if not extremely confident in saying not only did his journeys just begin there, but I'm sure the church gave him funds and whatever other things he might have needed to help facilitate his travels. And so that's a very evangelistic church, and good for them for supporting the preaching of the word as Paul wanted to do. So Paul and Barnabas, along with John Mark, set out in Acts chapter 13 to go and preach the gospel on the first journey. John Mark turns back, goes back, and leaves Paul and Barnabas. Reasons we're not sure why, but he does. Paul and Barnabas continue on, and they travel through various regions. Now, geographically, the first journey was the shortest of Paul's preaching trips. By far, it was the shortest. They didn't seem to go all that far, at least not when you compare it to the second and the third journey that Paul made. Now, this first journey, they cover some territory that would include areas like Lycaonia, Pisidia, Pamphylia, and probably even some cities that might be considered Galatian cities. Now, the first journey ends in Acts chapter 14. And if you'll notice, in Acts chapter 14, it says in verse 27, Acts 14, verse 27, when they had arrived, and that is they arrived in Antioch, verse 26, so the city that they began the journey in is where they end the journey as well. When they had arrived, verse 27, and gathered the church together, they began to report all things that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles, and they spent a long time with the disciples. They started in Antioch. The journey ends with them returning to Antioch, and it says they stayed there for a long time. They stayed there many days. All right. Now, here's the question. Where does the book of Galatians fit? One possibility is that it fits right here in the many days or the long time that Paul spent with the church in Antioch before Acts chapter 15. Now let's talk about Acts 15 for a minute, and let's see one argument as to why some would say that it should fit here. Do you remember in Acts chapter 15, there are some Christians of a Pharisaic Jewish background who came up to the city of Antioch and said to Gentile Christians in Antioch, if you really want to be saved, you have to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. And that was a very troubling thing, very unsettling thing. And Paul and Barnabas, the text says in Acts 15, had a great dispute with them and argued with them about this, saying, no, that is not the truth. That is not the gospel. You're presenting a perverted kind of a gospel. And so the church in Antioch says, okay, to settle this, we need to send Paul and Barnabas. Let me adjust my screen here. I noticed that you probably had the top of my head chopped off for the first few minutes of the video. We need to send Paul and Barnabas, along with some others, to Jerusalem to deal with this matter, to get this taken care of and find the truth on this. And so that's what happens in Acts 15. We have what's oftentimes referred to, although I don't really like the term, the Jerusalem Conference. All right? And after there's a lot of debate and discussion about this matter, do Gentiles who come to Christ have to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses or not? It's determined by the apostles, the elders in Jerusalem, and the text even says by the Holy Spirit. No, Gentiles don't have to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses in order to be saved. And so they decide to write a letter and send copies of this letter to various Gentile churches who have been affected by this teaching. And this letter makes it plain what is required of these Gentiles who are coming to the Lord. All right. Now, here is one of the arguments that's used to suggest that the book of Galatians fits between Acts 14 and Acts 15. I think there is some validity to this. I'm not sure that it is completely and fully convincing. If it was, there wouldn't be a debate about where Galatians fits, would there? But I do think it's logical, and I think it's possible. Those who say that the book of Galatians belongs between Acts 14 and 15, or after Paul's first journey, but before the Jerusalem conference, would point to this fact. When Paul writes to the Galatians, and you're familiar with the content of the letter because we just read it this week. The Galatians are turning away from the gospel because Judaizing teachers have told them, you need to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. And these Gentiles in Galatia are listening to this and doing that. They are starting to turn away from the gospel and the grace and the liberty of Christ so that they can become Jews. And Paul writes to them and he is saying, don't do this. It's a big mistake. So the same subject is under discussion and under consideration in the book of Galatians that came to be the subject of discussion in Acts 15. And the people who say that Galatians fits between 14 and 15 point to this. When Paul wrote to the Galatians, he made no reference to the letter that was drafted in Acts 15. Why didn't he do that? Why didn't Paul write to the Galatians and simply say, look guys, don't go into Judaism. Don't turn to Judaism and law keeping and all of those observances in the law. Don't do that because a whole bunch of us, leading figures in the church, got together in Jerusalem a few weeks ago or a few months ago, and we debated this, and we talked about this, and we decided that it wasn't necessary. And look, here's a copy of the letter that we wrote, and you need to just read this letter and see what we determined. He doesn't do that in Galatians. He makes no reference to this letter. And these who argue for that placement of Galatians would say it's because Acts 15 hasn't happened yet. Now, plausible? I think so. Is it absolutely the case? I don't think we can say that. Now, when you look at Acts 15, as we've briefly discussed already, and we've talked about the content of that, there are others who would say, no, Galatians doesn't fit between Acts 14 and 15. Galatians would actually fit after the events of Acts chapter 15 because, and this is their argument, one of the arguments, Galatians chapter 2 describes the meeting of Acts 15. In Galatians chapter 2, beginning at verse 1, Paul says that after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus also. And these would say that that is the meeting in Acts 15 that Luke records, the Jerusalem conference. That's what Paul is referring to in Galatians 2. Now, is that a bulletproof case? Is that an open and shut case? Is it easy? Are we certain that that's the same thing? No. Again, if it was, there wouldn't be any debate about where does Galatians fit. Is it plausible? Yes. Is it certain? I don't think so. So what am I saying in all of this? What I'm saying to you is there are some books of the New Testament, two in particular, that I struggle with knowing exactly where to put them. And you say, well, yeah, but Ben, in the schedule, you put it after Acts 15. I did. Is that because I'm absolutely convinced that Galatians was written after the Jerusalem conference? No, it's not. That's not why I put it there. I put it there simply because the content of the Jerusalem conference and the book of Galatians is very similar. I knew that it would be one of those two places, most likely, where Galatians fits. I'm not exactly sure what I think about it. I kind of vacillate between both positions from time to time. But I'm just giving you some background information as to some of the thinking about where these books fit. But this is more than just an academic exercise. And I really want you to understand that this is not just a dry and academic treatment of, intellectual snobbery and trying to figure out where these books fit so that we can have some superior kind of... That's not the point. This is not just an academic thing. There's a practical side to knowing how the New Testament fits together. There is a practical component to understanding how all of these books fit together, how Paul's journeys within the book of Acts fit with the epistles that he wrote that comprise the New Testament. How do these things all tie together? There's a very practical application of all of this. When you read in Acts chapter 15, about the debate over circumcision and whether Gentile Christians must keep the law of Moses or not in order to truly be saved. And then you go and read the book of Galatians and you see the exact same subject being discussed. That should tell us something as readers of the New Testament. We always have to ask questions when we read the Bible. Who wrote this? Who was he writing to? Why was he writing? What were the conditions of the day? What are the issues that are going on in the background that he is dealing with? Who, what, when, where, why? You remember those 5 questions that you were taught to ask in school? When you read something, ask those questions. Who, what, when, where, and why? What's the background of the writing? And when we ask those questions and we think about those as we read our New Testaments, we will have a much better grasp of not only how the books of the New Testament fit together, although I think that's critically important. It's so enlightening to understand that. But not only will we understand that, but we will understand the issues, the controversies, the challenges, the problems that the early church dealt with. Jew and Gentile relations was really the earliest big picture kind of problem that the church was dealing with. And when you see books like Galatians that deal with that, that gives you some indication as to where the book fits in the New Testament picture. So let me close as we think about Paul's travels and books that he writes and so forth. Let me close with this. On Paul's first journey, Acts 13 and 14, during the journey, how many letters did he write? And the answer to that is none. He wrote 0 during, let me emphasize that word, during the first journey. No letters written. After the first journey, but before the second journey, 1 letter, probably. And that's Galatians, the letter that we just read together. Again, does it fit between 14 and 15? Does it fit between 15 and 16? I'm not certain which one is right. A good case can be made for both. I'd suppose we don't really ever have to know the answer, but it does help for us to wrestle with it a little bit. 0 letters during the first journey, most likely 1 letter after the first journey. Galatians, arguably, I think probably, Paul's first letter. And I hope you enjoyed reading it this past week. Thanks for studying with me today.